I'm just going to wait while I see a lot of people are entering right now, so I'm just going to give it a moment and then we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to who just joined us. I'm just allowing more people to enter. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We will go ahead and get started. So I am Angela and I am with Compassion and Choices. Compassion and Choices is the nation's largest, oldest, and most active nonprofit working to expand options, improve care, and empower everybody to chart their end of life journey. And today with me, I have my colleague, Zena Regis. And Zena, wait, thank you. Zena is the Director of Faith Engagement at Compassion and Choices. And before her current role, she served as a hospice chaplain and grief care coordinator for almost a decade. And then also our special guest today is Dr. Pauline Boss. Pauline Boss is in Minnesota. So Dr. Pauline Boss is an educator and researcher who's widely recognized for her groundbreaking research that's known for the theory of ambiguous loss. She was also a family therapist for over 40 years. So National Grief Awareness Day is August 30th. And the day's mission is to educate people about grief, provide resources and those experiencing it, and create a space to share stories. So as an end-of-life advocacy organization, our focus is primarily on helping people to have an end-of-life experience that matches their values, priorities, and beliefs. However, I oversee some of our volunteer efforts, and I know that many of our volunteers are motivated to advocate for our cause because they have lost a loved one, or they are currently caring for somebody who has a terminal illness, or a person who is living with dementia. So if you've ever been in the role as a caregiver, kudos to you. I know that this is not everyone's experience, but I was my father's caregiver for a few years, and it was often complicated and chaotic, especially since he had loss of memory, which made it much more difficult since I didn't often know some of the conversations that he was having with his doctors. So even though we don't focus a lot on grief and loss, I just want to do something special for our supporters and invited Dr. Pauline Boss here because it really helped me. So about 10 years ago, I went to a caregiver conference in Phoenix at Duet, and I saw Dr. Boss speak about ambiguous loss, and it really resonated with me. Up until that point, I felt like I had lost my father and was grieving, but no one around me had recognized it because he was still alive. After going to this conference and having a name for it, the ambiguous loss, it really validated my feelings and empowered me. And then learning skills on how to cope with ambiguous loss was helpful, but I've also learned it's been continuous practice. And if you're out there and you need, a caregiver resource, I just want to highlight that Duet. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, and they're here in Phoenix, Arizona, but they do have a free online caregiving group. And then Zena, if you could share just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I am so happy to be here and I'm excited to see we have people from all over in the chat. Welcome everyone. I kind of uh invited myself to be a part of this because when Angela told me that Dr. Boss was going to join us, I was so excited because I am such a fangirl. And how I learned about Dr. Boss's work is when I was in seminary, I had an internship as a chaplain in a prison. And I was facilitating a group and I was like, I'm missing something. There's got to be something to help. So I went to where I try to solve all my problems, the library. And I can remember just like looking and seeing this book on the shelf. I can even remember where I saw it. And I was like, that sounds like that would be helpful for me. And it was immediately like I had to go get my own copy. And after my work, it just gave me so much language and framework to help me work through with the inmates what they were going through and help them like name what was happening. And so after that, I started working in hospice. And once again, I continued to return to this work and was so excited um, to have the myth of closure come out after the pandemic. And so I've just found Dr. Boss's work to be so helpful to me. And really, this is just kind of the bee in my bonnet. Really think about ritual. Ambiguous loss really helped me think so much about ritual and how to pass that on to inmates and also to my hospice patients and their families. And so, yeah, I just know that everyone is really in for a treat today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Angela, you're muted.
Thanks. I said I have one more announcement before we kick off. So you reminded me, Zena. I do have some of the books that Dr. Pauline Boss has written. And so when we send out the follow-up email with the video link to this, there's going to be just a brief survey for your feedback. And then I'll pick like 10 winners from it just randomly and mail you a copy of her book as well. So hopefully that helps you. So, well, if we can go ahead and get started, Dr. Pauline Boss, can you start with just sharing with us how you define ambiguous loss and what is it?
Thank you. Well, ambiguous loss, it has a simple definition. It's an unclear loss. And it's an unclear loss that has no verification. That is, there's no death certificate. There's no official recognition of the loss. Would be like someone who has dementia, would be a psychological ambiguous loss. They're physically present, but psychologically absent. But my first research was on the wives of men who were missing in action in Vietnam and Cambodia. So they were physically missing but kept psychologically present because the family members and the wives did not know if they were dead or alive. They couldn't grieve. In other words, the grief is frozen because you don't know for sure if they're dead. And then frequently you feel guilty for grieving because you might think you're wishing them dead. So we can talk about this unique kind of loss, ambiguous loss, which didn't have a name before the 1970s when I was in graduate school, and came up with the idea. Having a name allows us to cope. In other words, you can't cope with something until you know what it is. And Angela, that's probably what happened when you heard me speak in Phoenix. It gave a name to what you were experiencing and feeling with your father. Once you have a name, you can begin coping. Without a name, you're sort of in no man's land.
So those were the two primary ones that I did want to talk about today, just as it relates to, I think, a lot of our supporters. So physical absence with psychological presence, and then physical presence with psychological absence. And so you wrote a lot about those two in your first book that came out, I think, in the year 2000, maybe. But in your most recent book that came out in 2021, you mentioned two other types of ambiguous loss that you haven't researched so much. And I believe you said this is for future generations to really pick up and do. But can you just share just a little bit about those two for the audience so that they're familiar with them?
Yes. So again, ambiguous loss is simply an unclear loss. And it can be multiple ambiguous losses at the same time, and it can be personal. I think those are the two you want me to address, right?
Societal, too, I think was one of them.
And societal.
Yes.
Yes. And so we'll actually do three. Well, the last two are related. So the first one would, ambiguous loss is always based on attachment, and it cannot be an ambiguous loss unless you are connected and attached to that person or that thing. Could also be a pet, by the way. So you have to have some attachment to them. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the reaction of ambiguous loss. So that's an assumption, okay? So I came up in this last book with the idea that there is also personal ambiguous loss. because you're attached to your own body. You're attached to who you are. You're attached to your mind. So people in early dementia, early onset dementia, frequently are sad because they know they're losing their memory. They're losing their cognitive abilities. Or people who are terminally ill know that they are losing their strength and so on. And they are essentially sad about that, not just you, the observer, or the caregiver. So personal ambiguous loss can also happen. For example, if a woman has always hoped to have children and then she finds out she cannot, or she has to have a hysterectomy, that would be a personal ambiguous loss. She's still living, but she lost the ability to do something she was attached to. And, somebody could lose a leg, lose a limb, as they do in war and so on, in accidents. So you can have a personal ambiguous loss as well as a relational ambiguous loss with the family members. But the assumption is that you are attached to whatever it is you lost. Now, there can also be multiple ambiguous losses at the same time, where, for example, in your family, you may have a loved one who has dementia, but you may also have an elder, let's say, but you may also have a child who's on drugs and addicted. So that would be psychological absence in both cases, one elder and one young person. Or you could have a physical ambiguous loss in the family. Let's say where you're losing your health and can't walk anymore. Let's say, which happened to my husband with rheumatoid arthritis. And he grieved that because he was very athletic beforehand. And then you may also have someone in the family who has, let's say, addiction, which is another ambiguous loss. So they're physically present, but psychologically absent. So know that if you have that kind of pileup in your family of more than one ambiguous loss, you have a great deal of stress to deal with. So be aware of that. And then what I did in the last book was I raised it to a level of society, of a societal ambiguous loss. I wrote the book during COVID. After my husband died, I picked up the book again and had set it aside when I was a caregiver several years before. And since I was writing during COVID, it occurred to me that ambiguous loss can happen on a community level, a country level, or a global level, which was true when COVID hit. It was COVID presented us with a global ambiguous loss. We knew something was killing people, but we didn't know what it was. We were surrounded by ambiguity, at least until the scientists came up with a vaccine. And it was very scary because we didn't know what the problem was precisely. And we had ambiguous losses because you couldn't see your elders in a nursing home, or you couldn't be beside your loved ones if they were dying in a hospital. Oftentimes there were even mass graves, so you didn't even know where the body was. All of these are ambiguous losses. And our youngsters had them too. I mean, the rituals of going to a prom, the rituals of graduation from high school, from college, all of these traditional rituals were canceled. And so these young people didn't have them. And so it was a canceling of a ritual can be an ambiguous loss too, because it involves the people who would be there to celebrate with you, or let's say it's a funeral, to comfort you. So, and today, many people are using the ambiguous loss theory or framework to apply to climate change, which is another global problem. that we're facing now. The mountain is still there, but the glacier is gone. The water is still there, but it's no longer pure to drink. And so you may have your own thoughts about that. But if the framework helps people to acknowledge a problem and then to begin working on it, then it is useful. It's a useful theoretical framework. Does that help?
That's so helpful. I love in the myth of closure how you give us this language to talk about the pandemic, because I think for so many people, we just felt like we had to get through it. And so naming it as an ambiguous loss is just really, really powerful. I think my question is around how can we get our culture to name it, what people lost? Is it just saying it or just acknowledging that we were in loss? I think about, I had a patient when I was working in hospice. She was 103 and she
Right.
said to me, she had gone through all these things in her life, and she was just sharing with me so many things. And then we're in the middle of the pandemic. This was the beginning, it was like March, April 2020. And she said, but this is the hardest of it all, because in every other opportunity I could gather, I had the support of my of my community. I could go to my faith community. She loved rhododendrons. She could go to her rhododendron club for gardening. And she said, I'm just alone in this.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think that gave me permission to really name that this is, I know people are so tired of hearing this. This is an unprecedented time. But I feel like when we got the vaccines and we kind of opened back up, we never really named that time and kind of the unresolved losses that we're still processing. And so I
Yeah.
just, as you see us, I would love to know, like, what are your thoughts on how we can like kind of name some of that we're still moving through?
Well, especially the young people learn to be alone, and they haven't completely recovered by making friends the way many of us did growing up, just going into the neighborhood and playing with the other kids. So, and of course, the other thing is that these social media, they're more into social media and therefore not out playing ball with somebody or not out talking with somebody in a restaurant or in school. Those are not good things. And it affected the older population and certainly the caregiving population. Caregiving means that you have to stay home a lot as it is to take care of the person you're caring for. But when the pandemic hit, you were literally a prison in your own home with the person you were taking care of. And if you had to go to a hospital or a caring place to see your loved one, you were frightened. You were frightened. I was frightened. I remember that clearly. It was a crazy time. And we're still having reverberations from it, as you say. Some people cope. The idea of naming it comes out of stress. Actually, Baldwin was quoted as saying something like, if you can't name it, you can't cope with it. But it also comes out of stress theory in the 1970s. And so it's an old idea. In order to cope with something, you have to know what it is. So what I say to people is when I was doing therapy, what you're experiencing isn't called an ambiguous loss. It's a loss that has no resolution right now. It's one of the most painful types of loss there is. It's not your fault. I always add that because it's unsolvable, you see. And so people think they should be able to fix it for their loved one. And you can't, especially if it's a terminal illness coming, or if it could be physically terminal or psychologically terminal. Mostly it is when somebody is not the way they used to be. They're sliding away from you. And that's an agonizing thing to watch. And yet it's what most caregivers have to watch. It's unlike being a caregiver for a child, you see, a baby or a child. There, it's also very isolating and a lot of work. But the trajectory is upward. They get to a point where they don't need you so much anymore. And caregiving for dementia or for a terminal illness, for example, is downward trajectory. It won't get better. So caregivers must find something to do in their lives with healthy people to maintain their own health. Caregivers die at a much higher rate, somewhere in the high 60s, than their same age group. 60% higher than their same age group. So caregiving is dangerous to your health unless you maintain a contact with other people, frequently peers, other caregivers is a really good idea. And you can do that online. The research shows that online peer groups are just as effective as in-person peer groups. I was surprised by that. But it's true. And those of you who can't get away from the person you're taking care of, at least could go into the other room for a while and do a Zoom. I highly recommend that. But if you can get away, get out, walk around the block with a friend, go to your church or synagogue or mosque at some point in time and meet with some people you know, that would be ideal. And you'd need a sitter to come while you were gone. That would be a good investment for your own health.
Thank you. We have 3 questions. We're going to answer. I saw yours, Sid, and we'll answer that as we move forward. But just 2 quick questions. So one question, and I have a feeling the answer is both yes to this. But one would be, what's going on with our democracy right now? There's a lot of chaos kind of going on. Some people believe, elections are stolen, others not. So, but this exact question was losing our democracy. Is that ambiguous loss? So, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I think you talk about January 6th.
In this last book, I did take the liberty of, I think it's in the last chapter, to talk about the national scene. And before that, I give a little review of all the bad times the world has had, like the Black Death, the Black Plague eons ago, and so on. And I just outline what happened over the years, hundreds of years ago until now. The last time of trouble, I agree with the questioner. We have a time of trouble right now. I agree with that. And a great uncertainty and ambiguity in our, let's say, rituals and our customs and so on. So I agree with the questioner on that. But it has happened before. And it seems like it happens, like every 50 years or so, we're in chaos. The last time we were in chaos was the 60s. You all remember that. And it lasts usually, we call this sort of a paradigm shift. It lasts often 10, 20 years. It takes a while for a chaotic time to iron itself out. But my feeling is that over the eons, it does iron itself out after a while. And all of a sudden there's a shift. It's like a tipping point shift. And things start going a different direction. After the 60s, we had quite a few decades of peacefulness and prosperity until we didn't again. It goes up and down. And that's sort of how it is around the world. But right now, we are in a terrible time of loss around the world. All the missing, thousands of people missing in Ukraine, in Gaza, and Israel. There's terrible things going on. There are terrible things going on here. I have a feeling things are beginning to shift. I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but that's how the human race seems to go, up and down, with paradigm shifts across time. I hope and pray that the shift will come soon because we need it.
Thanks. And we are now, it's 11:30 my time. So I know we're kind of like halfway through. So I want to get started on talking about coping with it and resiliency. I do want to just highlight, I would say yes, let me know if you disagree with me, Dr. Boss. But another question was, isn't aging itself a period of loss that we sometimes deal with alone? So is there loss I can't deal with? Mobility, food must be chewed, sight and hearing and aging. I would say that can be ambiguous loss, as you were talking about personal ambiguous loss.
I agree.
And then yes to this, I feel like yes to this one, especially, but long periods of estrangement with a family member, such as a sibling, would qualify as ambiguous loss as well.
Yes, estrangement is on the rise. And when I was doing therapy, it takes a long time for families where there is estrangement to work. For example, 5 years is the shortest time I have ever reunited a family, 5 years of therapy. And it is the person who cares the most who usually goes for therapy, and the rest of the family won't come. So it starts with individual therapy and gradually grows. The expert on family estrangement now would be Joshua Coleman, with a C, Coleman. I think he has a website. And he's written a book on family estrangement. It requires a certain kind of therapy. It is an ambiguous loss. And Joshua knows that. And it is an ambiguous loss on both sides.
Thank you. So can we talk a little bit about resiliency? But what I would like you to do, and I was sharing this with Zena this morning, is I keep seeing all this stuff on social media that's like, I don't want to have to be resilient. Like, I just want things to be fine again. And I kind of disagreed with that, just because I was told, and I didn't really appreciate it till I got older, but that ever since I've been little, people have told me I'm very resilient. But can you define it so that as we move forward in this conversation, the audience know what you're talking about when we're talking about resiliency and how that helps with ambiguous loss?
Well, it's a resiliency and a way of thinking. Now, there'll be cultural differences amongst your listeners, and because your belief systems and your socializations may have varied. And I'm going to bring up the idea that the tool that helps with resiliency when there is ambiguous loss is both and thinking. Most of us like to think in absolutes. You either win or you lose. And we just watched a lot of athletes who won or lost. There's nothing in between. So it's very absolute thinking, and you want your accountant to think that way too. 2 + 2 is 4, period. It doesn't vary. So there are things in your life that need to be absolute. But when you come up with ambiguous loss, where it's not clear if the person is absent or present, and even dead or alive. Or are they the way they always were, or are they no longer the way they used to be? When you have that kind of ambiguity, the only way to cope with it and lower your stress is to shift to both and thinking. Here's an example. With someone who has dementia, if you're a caregiver for someone who has dementia, you can think this way: she's both here and gone, which is true, which is the closest to the truth you can get. Or you can say she's both gone and sometimes here, depending how it is for you. If it's somebody in a family where there's alienation, where your child won't talk to you anymore, and they move out and to another city, you would say, he is physically absent, but still here in my heart and mind. And you could say, he is gone and maybe not. He might be back one day. That kind of both and thinking, or dialectical thinking, is the only way to cope with ambiguous loss. And someone earlier must have asked about, is aging an ambiguous loss? Yes, it is. It's personal ambiguous loss. You're still here, but you're not the way you used to be. And so you can think absolutely about it. I must have a facelift. I must color my hair. I must do all this to be the way I always was. I'm not going to change. That's a more rigid approach, and it'll present more stress than if you sort of lean into it. I both miss my young body and am happy to have a healthy older body, a reasonably healthy older body. I mean, of course you miss it. It's lost. So both thinking is a tool that will help you live with ambiguous losses of all kinds.
We had somebody make a comment too in the Q&A that I think really gives a good example of this too, but they said an older community member drove his car out of town for an errand and was never heard from again. There's tension between admitting he is gone forever, probably dead, and we will never know, and holding out hope that he will, I think it's like likely return. And I feel like I've read in your book stuff about that too, especially when dealing with missing people. And I think that in one of the books too, you talk about, children who have been kidnapped and parents
right.
who, have to continue living on, and how thinking like this person is not with you, but not wanting to give up on that person, and that can still be very healthy.
Well, what you want to do with that, again, is the both and thinking. He's physically gone. He may be gone forever and maybe not. I would find that helpful, but you each have to make up your own both and statement, which will lower your stress, because again, it's as close to the truth as you can get. But the important thing to remember, it's not your fault. That's the one people forget, especially caregivers. You can't control everything, and sometimes people do things that make them disappear. So be aware that both and thinking will help you. He's both gone, and I remember him. When our loved ones go, even when they die, you know that a transformation has taken place, at least if it's healthy grief. Transformation has taken place. They're no longer here physically in body, and you remember them in your heart and mind. So it's both. It's continuing bonds. When somebody goes missing, you can't, oh, by the way, the myth of the word closure is a myth. It's very unhelpful. Closure is a very good word. Here in Minnesota, when we have a snowstorm and they close roads, they say road closures. That's correct use of the term. Or when a store goes bust and they close the store. But with human relationships, it's a very harmful term. It's hurtful. You can't just shut the door on somebody you cared about, on somebody to whom you were attached. So that's why we use the both and thinking. It allows you to keep the door ajar. Not that they're coming back, but that you won't forget them. And so it allows also for a sliver of hope, but we encourage you to hope for something new. Just hoping for the person to return can become an obsession, like people who are still searching for soldiers from World War II. And it seems to me that it becomes an obsession for the family then. And maybe there would be something new to hope for, like starting a scholarship in honor of that person, or simply living a good life in honor of them, or putting up a memorial about the missing person. And if it's a group of people, like after a tsunami or an earthquake, we encourage it to be not a statue, but a listing of names. When a person goes missing, you want to remember their name. And that can be a very inexpensive memorial that way. So now I'm talking more about large-scale ambiguous losses. But with your personal ambiguous losses in your family members and so on, or yourselves, know that it's a difficult loss. Don't be so hard on yourself. It's harder than a clear-cut loss with a death certificate. It lingers. It's literally, the grief is prolonged. But it's not a prolonged grief disorder. The disorder is in the type of loss, not in you. So don't let a therapist tell you that you have a disorder. The context has the disorder. The ambiguity is the culprit. Okay? And the ambiguity in our culture, which is quite control and mastery oriented, is very stressful and problematic. Now, if you are from a more Eastern culture, Buddhism, for example, can tolerate ambiguity more than most of us can in this Western culture. So no, there's a difference. There's also a tolerance for ambiguity scale, which you can Google. I take a look at it. It has things on it like, I like change. I like to visit with people I never knew before. I like to learn a foreign language. I like to travel to a country I've never been before alone. Some of those, I mean, I've struggled. I come from a Swiss background, so they're known for precision, not tolerance for ambiguity, right? So I struggle with increasing tolerance for ambiguity. And that's how you do it. You may want to listen to music that isn't so absolute in its form, jazz, for example. Go to improvisation theater. Get to learn a new person. Play a new game. Do something you've always done differently. Walk a new path. In other words, increase your own tolerance for ambiguity, which is especially good exercises for caregivers, because you can't cure the person you're taking care of.
That's wonderful advice. I want to encourage, we have some great questions in the Q&A. Allison has lifted up putting the questions in the Q&A box versus the chat, just to make sure that we see them and they answer them. So please, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A chat box. And if you have any trouble with that, let us know. We have some great questions, but I wanted to, before we go into all of the questions, you do such a masterful job at laying out, just along the lines of what you're talking about, how people are really attracted to this linear idea of the grief process, and have, in many ways, kind of misapplied Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's
Yeah.
5 stages of grief to the grieving process when it wasn't intended that way. Will you talk a little bit about this, what you propose in the way that we think about the grieving process?
Well, mostly I'm following the research too, not just my clinical experience, but the research is shifting too. Kubler-Ross's last book is the one you should read, where she recants on the 5 stages. And she said she never did mean them for dying. She meant for the person who's left behind, the griever. She meant them for the dying person. But now she was dying. She had a stroke, a massive stroke, and couldn't walk anymore. And she had to live with that for 9 years. She was very angry. And she said it's messy. She said she felt like she was an airplane on the runway and couldn't take off. And she felt controlled, which, as you might guess, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross didn't like. By the way, she and I both had Swiss parents, so I understand that. The 5 stages are fine, but not in a line. The problem with linear models for grief is that people misunderstand and think that when they get to the 5th one, they won't have any pain anymore. Well, what we know now from research, and certainly therapists and chaplains have known this, is that bonds continue. So the idea of continuing bonds is the idea now. Yes, there's a transformation. You know the person has died, or the person is not the way they used to be if they're still alive. And yet you love them. You still can love the memory of them if they have died. You'll honor them, whatever feels right to you. So they're both physically gone and in my heart and mind forever. And 20 years from now, you may still shed a tear if you hear a song or you see a place where the 2 of you had a good time long ago. That's normal grief. That's normal grief. You do not have to get over it. And closure is not the word you want. What you want instead of closure is certainty. We would all like to have certainty about whether our loved one is dead or alive and where their body, where their remains might be. That's what we'd like to have. It's not always possible, and that's when it's ambiguous loss. So that makes the grief frozen. You're stuck. You can't grieve as if it were a death freely, have a funeral, have your friends around you sitting Shiva or whatever kinds of rituals you have. And therefore, society needs to know more about ambiguous loss to go and support those people. We know what to do when there's a death in the neighborhood, but we don't know what to do when there's ambiguous loss. And I'm hoping that this will give you some ideas. You go to a person and just be with them and help, and perhaps spell them so they could go to church, or spell them so they could go for a walk. So I think continuing bonds is the term we use now. Freud, if you read Freud's letters, he talks about, he will indicate continuing bonds. When one of his patients gave him condolences that his daughter died of the flu in 1920, he said, "She's not gone, she's here." And he patted his vest pocket and he took out some kind of locket. I don't know what was in it, but perhaps it was her photo or lock of hair. Well, Mr. Freud, you didn't write about that academically. Academically, he wrote about discontinuing bonds. And here he was showing continued bonds. So I think we should pay more attention to some of the literature now. Robert Niemeyer is good. Bonanno is good with research. And it's Klass, Klass, who wrote the book, or who edited the book, Continuing Bonds, in the 1990s. It was not popular then, but it is now. Took a while. So if any of you are told you should find closure, just tell them, you know, that's an out-of-date idea. Even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross would not want that term used.
So Sid had asked, how do family caregivers deal with ambiguous loss and the dementia of their spouse or parent? And I know that we talked about both and thinking, normalizing ambivalence, building your resiliency to do so. And I think maybe kind of talking about adapting your sense of identity might be helpful too for caregivers when working with that. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
And the sense of identity is one of the first places to go, actually, that is confusing when you have ambiguous loss. And we might be talking about roles here. Let's say your parent has dementia, is sliding into dementia, and you, the daughter or the son, have to take care of them. And they say, "Look, I'm the parent. You're the child. I don't have to do what you say." That's very confusing. Also, they might not even say anything, but it's confusing in your mind. I'm now the parent of my parent. So one of the things that helps the most with this is peer groups. Find some other people who are doing the same type of caregiving you're doing to share ideas of how they do it. I find humor works because it is actually rather comical. I remember when my mother needed new slippers, I would go drive a long way because I was living in another city to buy her new slippers. And after about the fourth pair of slippers I bought, she didn't like. I said, "Well, you're going to have to pick one from here because I can't do it anymore." And she says, "Well, I'm your mother." And I said, "Well, mother, I've tried, but I can't do it anymore. So pick one of these from the multiple pairs we had." And she looked at me, and then we both started laughing because it had gotten silly. And she was, by the way, she didn't have dementia, so that made it easier. She just couldn't walk. So we just laughed at it. And she said, "Well, I guess you're the parent now, aren't you?" Well, that was a lovely thing when she said that. It's not always that easy. But I think you have to make the transition in your head that I'm in charge now. Caregivers who are in the most trouble are the ones not taking their power and agency. Because it's a chaotic situation, as you said, Angela. Somebody has to be in charge, and the person who has cognitive disabilities can't be in charge. So you have to be in charge, and you have to say, "I'm going now. I need to go for a walk. So-and-so will be with you while I'm gone." Or you can say, "I'm having dinner with a friend," which you should do. And and I'll be back in 2 hours. They won't like it. Or you'll say, somebody's coming in to stay with you while I go out. They'll say, I don't want strangers in the house. Well, that makes you a prisoner. And you can't allow that. So caregivers, whether or not you were in charge before, you need to take care of yourself, because it's very dangerous to your health. You need to talk with other people who do not have dementia, because your cognitive abilities will go down if you don't. You need the stimulation of your own brain to talk with other people. So we're encouraging a social life. It may be minimal, but you need it. You must have it. And at the same time, you must take care of the person, but taking care of the person doesn't always mean you. And if they resist somebody else coming in, you just have to override that, because you need to get away periodically. So obviously there's a difference between male and female caregivers in my age group. I would bet that in the younger age group, that won't be so stark a difference. So male caregivers tend to be more administrative and in their caregiving style, less emotional. Women tend to do more emotional caregiving. We need both. Both men and women need both. Men need more emotional caregiving. Women need more administrative caregiving. Now that's generalizing. And I think if you go into the younger age group of women, they may not be socialized to patriarchy as much as we were.
We will make sure we gather it for you, but we have some real fangirling over your words, Dr. Boss, in the chat. You are everyone's new favorite celebrity, so we want you to know that. I know we're coming to the end of our time, but we have a question that's been lifted up. And it's from Connie. It says, my mom is suffering with a terminal illness with days to live. We have not spoken in over a year. How do I both and think when she passes?
Can she be near her or not? Is she physically nearby, but just hasn't spoken?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Connie, if you'll answer that in the chat if you have the opportunity. But yeah, that's what we have in the answer, is that we don't know, but they haven't spoken in over a year.
I would override whatever reason for not speaking is. And if you're far away, put a phone up to her ear and say something. And if you're nearby, see her. If you're not allowed to see her, write something. And that's, I'm saying, for you. You may regret your entire life if you don't do something. Don't expect her to speak to you. In other words, it's not transactional. Do what you need to do as a human being, as your own humanity. Say something to her. Either have somebody else read it, put a phone up to her ear, so that you know you said something before she leaves this earth.
And it looks like she's reached out and she said her mom hasn't responded. But when I'm looking at, when reading your book about the myth of closure, you talk about complex grief and that losses are complex and multifaceted. And that closure oversimplifies the grieving process. Is there anything you want to add to that point?
Well, in this case that we were talking about, don't expect a response. You see, that's what stops us in alienation. You have to take your own point, your own agency, and say, I'm going to speak, even if I don't get anything back. What I will get back is knowing I did my part. I don't expect the other person to do anything. So that kind of behavior works because it's such an imperfect situation. When you have that kind of ambiguity in a situation, don't expect perfection. You know, I'll go for good enough. And I think it would be good to speak to somebody, even if it's just a simple sentence. Just to say you did the right thing, and therefore you don't have a regret the rest of your life. But don't expect anything back from that person. What you will get back is your own humanity, your own kindness.
Thank
Did I
you.
answer your question? I'm not sure I did.
I think somebody said Dr. Boss is a boss, so I think you're doing good.
I was Professor Boss, which was
So somebody just said so not using the word closure, and we'll end with this one because I know we're coming up on the top of the hour. But what would you use instead? And I think we're talking about methods of continuing bonds, and living with ambiguity and learning ways to do that. But is there anything that you want to add on that note?
Well, instead of closure, you want certainty, as much certainty as you can get, as much information as you can get. But also, I think you want remembrance. If you cared about the person, or even if you didn't, you may remember them. In one case, you may want to live life with some things they did. If you didn't like them, let's say they were abusive to you, you want to keep them in mind as what not to do. So sometimes closing the door on someone is artificial, and psychologically you don't grow as much as if you keep them in your mind, even if they're physically gone, and live life in a way to honor them, or live life in a way to not be like them. In other words, let them influence you one way or the other.
Thank you so much. So we're right on time. So just a reminder, if you missed it when if you were just getting on a little late, we were going to send out the recording of this. And then I'm just going to send out a survey for feedback, and then pick like a couple. I don't know, about 8 books maybe that Dr. Pauline Boss wrote. And so we'll pick some winners of that, and then I'll mail you the books. But any last thing you want to say, Zena or Dr. Boss?
I just want to say thank you. This was amazing, Dr. Boss. And even if you don't get a free book, go get the books. As you can see, just from this little time that we had with Dr. Boss, there's so many insights that will just inform your life in so many amazing ways.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to compliment you on your organization and what you're doing for everyone, because caregivers and people who are dealing with end-of-life issues are sad. By the way, they're not all depressed. That's incorrect. Maybe a quarter might be clinically depressed, but all people dealing with end-of-life and caregiving have some sadness. That's a normal reaction to a loss, the ambiguous loss. And you're dealing with that because human connection is the treatment for sadness. And you're doing that. You're doing that. So thank you for that. Even if the connection is virtual, it works.
Yes. Thank you so much. I think when I hit end, we're all gonna disappear. So Dr. Pauline Boss, I'll just send you a quick follow-up email after this, but I thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. So
Thank you
thank you
to you, and bye everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.